The desert in summer does not forgive. It does not forgive weakness. It does not forgive hesitation. It does not forgive the body that runs out of water on the second afternoon, or the man who stops believing in extraction on the third morning. 6 Navy SEALs had been pinned behind enemy lines for 71 hours. No satellite link, no extraction window, no confirmation that command even knew they were still breathing. And then one by one the enemy stopped advancing. Not because they chose to, because something unseen was cutting them down. No audible report, no drone overhead, no friendly call sign on any frequency. Just bodies dropping in the sand at intervals no natural shooter could explain. The team leader, Chief Petty Officer Derek Holt, had run enough missions to know the difference between a lucky break and a pattern. What he was watching was a pattern. On the 71st hour, they followed the angle of incoming rounds backward, across 3 kilometers of open desert, to a low ridge that offered exactly one viable firing position. They found her there, face down in the sand, a bolt-action rifle beside her, coated in fine ochre dust. When they turned her over, she was barely conscious, sunburned past recognition, lips cracked and bleeding, breathing in shallow pulls. She looked like the desert had already begun to claim her. One of the SEALs picked up the rifle. He turned it over in his hands, found the engraving on the stock small, deliberate, cut by someone who did not make things official unless they were certain. 4,102 meter. He stood there for a long moment. Nobody spoke. Derek Holt looked at the number and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he looked at the woman in the sand. "She didn't come to rescue us," he said, barely above a whisper. He crouched beside her, checked her pulse. "She's been keeping us alive for 3 days. The mission briefing had been clean. It always was. 6-man reconnaissance element. 48 hours on the ground. Confirmed presence of logistics infrastructure at a grid referenced 12 kilometers northeast of the last known forward position. No engagement unless fired upon. Extract via prearranged pickup at 0300 on day 3. The team: Chief Petty Officer Derek Holt, Team Lead. Petty Officer First Class Raymond Stokes, Communications. Petty Officer Second Class Cole Mathers, Medical. Petty Officers Marcus Webb, Eli Tanner, and Josh Pruitt rounding out the element. They inserted clean. No contact for the first 6 hours. Then the satellite uplink died. It happened at 0217 on night 1, just a soft click in Stokes's earpiece, and then the kind of silence that has weight to it. He ran the diagnostics twice. Nothing mechanical, signal was being eaten. He told Holt. Holt told the team to hold position and give it 40 minutes. 40 minutes became 2 hours. 2 hours became dawn. By the time the sun crested the eastern ridgeline and the temperature began its climb toward 47 degrees Celsius, it was clear that something larger was wrong. The jamming was deliberate, layered, military grade, not the improvised kind, which meant someone had anticipated them or anticipated someone at this grid. Holt made the call to push toward their secondary exfil point, a dry wadi 6 kilometers south. They moved carefully, used the low ground, stayed off the skyline. They made it 400 meters before the first contact. It was not a patrol. It was a blocking position, and it had been waiting. The team went to ground fast. Tanner took a round through the meat of his left forearm in the first 30 seconds, which he taped himself without breaking stride. They returned fire, broke contact, moved east to a cluster of ancient rock formations that rose from the flat sand like broken teeth. They consolidated there. 2 approaches, defensible. Enough shade for the middle hours of the day. Holt did the math that no one wanted him to do out loud. Water, 1.5 liters per man remaining. At this temperature, with the physical output they'd already burned, that was approximately 20 hours before the first man started showing cognitive decline. Communications, 0. Enemy, unknown numbers, known position east and south, possibly circling north. Extraction, impossible without communications, and possibly compromised at the site anyway. He did not share the full math. He shared what was needed: hold the position, conserve water, wait for the jamming to lift. What he did not say, because saying it would accomplish nothing, was that he was no longer certain the jamming would lift on any timeline that mattered. Night fell on day 1. The temperature dropped to 26 degrees, which felt cold against skin that had spent 10 hours in 47. Webb took first watch. Holt lay back against the rock and listened to the desert. At 0140, Webb made a quiet sound, not alarm, something closer to confusion. Holt was beside him in 2 seconds. Contact? No. That's what's weird. Webb pointed east, toward the last known position of the flanking element they'd clocked at dusk. There were 4 of them staged behind that berm. I've been watching them for an hour. They moved twice. Standard pattern. He paused. One of them just dropped. Holt raised his optics. The berm was 200 meters away. He could see 3 figures low, still, alert. Not 4. Where's the 4th? That's what I'm saying. He went down. I didn't hear anything. No shot, no grenade, nothing. He just went down. Holt swept the terrain. Nothing. Probably heat casualty, Pruitt said from behind them. Nobody disagreed. The desert killed its own. But Holt kept watching for another hour, and he did not entirely believe the heat casualty explanation. The man had dropped too fast. Too clean. He said nothing, and eventually tried to sleep. Day 2 arrived with the sun like a physical pressure against the skull. The enemy tightened the perimeter. 3 separate elements, moving in coordinated bounds, pushing the containment ring inward. Holt could read the geometry of it. They were being herded toward a choke point, a place where whatever firepower was waiting could engage on terms that were entirely favorable. The team held. They did not give ground. At 0930, the element advancing from the northeast stopped. 2 men down in a span of 4 minutes. The survivors reversed course immediately, pulled back 200 meters, and went to ground. Whoever was commanding them was disciplined enough to recognize the situation had changed, but Holt could not identify what had changed it. No rounds had come from the team's position. He ran a quick check. Nobody had fired. That's 2 and 4 minutes, Mathers said quietly, beside him. What's the range on those positions from us? 320. Maybe 340. Too far for anyone to miss the report. We'd hear something. They would. A rifle firing at 300 meters, even suppressed, left a signature. Wind displacement. A faint concussive wave. You learn to feel it before you heard it in environments like this. There had been nothing. Holt thought. Drone. It was the first rational explanation. An asset he didn't know about, providing overwatch without announcement. Command sometimes ran those on separate channels specifically to preserve operational security. It would explain the silence, the range, the precision, but drones left visual signatures. Camera glint, engine noise at low altitude in still desert air carried, and there was nothing above them but blue sky and, by midday, a heat shimmer that distorted the horizon into liquid. Maybe it's a sniper, Tanner said. His arm had swollen overnight, tight against the tape. He hadn't complained once. What sniper? Webb asked. Tanner shrugged his good shoulder. One we don't know about. A sniper we don't know about. Operating in our area of operations, at ranges we can't identify, without any coordination with us? I'm not saying it's logical. I'm saying it fits. Holt said nothing. At 1,340, the southern element made a push. 4 men, aggressive, moving fast across open ground, toward the east approach of the rock formation. It was tactically sound. Exploit the noon heat when defenders were degraded. Move fast and trust momentum. The first man made it 60 meters. The second made it 40. The third stopped moving before he reached the open ground. The fourth reversed before his feet had fully left cover. None of them were hit by anything from the team's position. Holt had watched every one of his people. Nobody had raised a weapon. The desert had done it. Something in the desert had done it. He kept that thought where it belonged, which was private. What he said to the team was, "Hold, we hold." By late afternoon, a pattern had emerged that Holt could not explain away. Every time the enemy committed to movement toward their position, the commitment was punished. Not always fatally, but consistently, precisely, with a rhythm that suggested calculation, not reaction. Webb was the one who finally said it plainly. Someone's running overwatch on us. Has been since last night at minimum. Could be an asset we weren't read into, Stokes offered. Could be, Holt said. He did not elaborate. But he was thinking about the range. The unknown quantities of what the terrain looked like from 3, 4, 5 kilometers out. The angles that would be required to reach the positions that had been hit. He was thinking about what kind of shooter, what kind of discipline and physical condition would be required to hold a position in this desert for 24 hours and maintain that level of precision. He did not like the answer his mind kept producing, because it implied something about the situation on the ground that he did not have room to process yet. Water was down to 1/3 of original supply. He focused on that, on keeping the team moving forward by increments. She had been in position for 51 hours before the SEALs were compromised. She had not known they were going to be there. Her mission had nothing to do with them, or rather, it had nothing to do with them at the outset. She had been inserted 72 hours before their operation, solo, for a target that was confirmed at a fixed location. Long-range confirmation, no engagement, observe and report. But her communications had died in the same jamming envelope that took down the SEAL team's uplink, and her target had moved before she got eyes on. So she had been lying on a flat piece of elevated ground, a ridge that crested at roughly 8 meters above the surrounding desert, which in this terrain felt like standing on the roof of the world in a temperature that reached 49 degrees at peak, with a canvas ground sheet that reflected rather than absorbed, and a water supply she had been rationing since hour 30. Her name was Sergeant First Class Vivienne Carver. She was 31 years old. She had been shooting competitively since she was 15, entered the Army at 18, spent 3 years in conventional infantry before being selected, and spending another 4 years in a unit that did not have a name on any public-facing document. She had been deployed to environments like this 4 times. She did not think of herself as a legend. The word made her uncomfortable. What she was, precisely, was patient. Patient and thorough and capable of sitting with discomfort for longer than most people could sit with comfort. When she first identified the 6-man element moving through her area of operations on the afternoon of day 1, she had run through her options. They were not reading as hostile. Movement pattern was wrong. equipment profile was wrong, and they were moving with the kind of disciplined urgency that belonged to people who were trying not to be seen rather than people who were looking for a fight. She tracked them to the rock formation. Then she identified the containment elements moving in from 3 axes. She ran the math. 6 men. 1 arm already compromised. She could see the tape on the one with the short dark hair. Limited water based on kit configuration. No communications, or they'd have broken contact differently. Containment tightening over a timeline of approximately 18 to 24 hours before the geometry became untenable. She had her own problems. But her own problems had, at that point, become abstract. The target was gone. Her mission was suspended. What was in front of her was a decision about what to do with the next 70 hours. She had chosen, not because she had orders to, not because anyone would know. She chose because the alternative was lying on this ridge for 3 days and watching 6 people die at a distance she could have done something about. And she was not built for that kind of inaction. She confirmed range to the first position, 3,840 meters. She spent 40 minutes on her ballistics notebook. Wind speed at surface, estimated at altitude, temperature differential, humidity near 0, the Coriolis effect at this latitude and bearing. The rifle was chambered in 408 Che tac. The optics were a first focal plane scope. She had zeroed herself at 2,000 meters, which meant she was working with come-ups she had verified to 3,000 and extrapolating beyond. She had done it before, not at this range, close enough to understand the principles. The first shot, at 0140 on night 1, took 23 seconds of flight time. She watched through the scope, adjusted her natural point of aim twice during the trigger press, accounting for drift. Held her breath for a count of 8 after the break. The figure at the berm went down. She did not feel anything specific. She filed the result in the same part of her mind where she kept all results noted, categorized, moved past. She cycled the bolt, checked the remaining positions. 2 had not moved. 1 had gone still, in a way that suggested they'd heard something despite the distance. She let them sit. Patience was the resource she had in longest supply. The 3rd day began the way the 2nd had ended, in total silence. The enemy had pulled their perimeter back overnight. Holt read that as a mixed signal. Either they were reassessing after taking losses they hadn't anticipated, or they were tightening a different kind of noose. He posted double watches through the pre-dawn hours and told everyone to drink what water they had left in measured sips. By 0800, Pruitt was showing symptoms. He wasn't dramatic about it. Pruitt was never dramatic. He was a quiet, methodical person from a small town in western Montana, the kind of man who did not complain because he came from a place where complaining accomplished nothing. But his speech was slower than normal. He was repeating questions. His eyes had a slightly unfocused quality that Mathers recognized as early heat stroke, and Mathers told Holt quietly, without ceremony, that Pruitt needed water and shade within 4 hours, or they were going to have a serious secondary problem on top of their primary problem. Holt gave Pruitt the remainder of his own water. He told nobody he'd done this. At 0930, the largest push of the operation began. 8 men, 2 vehicles, a technical with a mounted weapon in the bed, and a second vehicle carrying personnel. They came from the west, which had been, until that morning, the quietest axis. They were moving fast and using the vehicle's speed as suppression, firing in bursts to keep heads down, the technical's weapon throwing large caliber rounds against the rock formation in a way that sent chips of ancient stone into the air like hail. Tanner was hit again, grazed above the left knee, not serious, but he was down to 1 functional limb on the left side. Webb laid down covering fire. Holt maneuvered toward the northern approach, trying to get an angle on the technical. Then the technical's driver went down. The vehicle veered, hit a rut in the hard sand, stopped, then the gunner, then the vehicle behind it, the driver first, then, 20 seconds later, one of the personnel in the back. The whole assault stalled. The surviving personnel dismounted, went to ground, and did not advance again. Holt was pressed against rock, trying to understand what he was seeing. He had not fired. Webb had not fired in the last 60 seconds. The technical was 200 meters away and now stationary. Nobody in the team had a clear shot at the dismounted personnel. Something else had stopped them. Something at a range that left no trace. He looked up at the sky, reflexively nothing. He swept the terrain in a 360 nothing. He looked at the sand around the stopped vehicles and could see the disturbance pattern of rounds impacting at extreme oblique angles, hitting the ground at the geometry of shots coming in from very far, very high, not high altitude, elevated position. He did not think about it any further. He did the only thing he could do, which was hold the position and keep the team together. By early afternoon, it was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt fragile, like the desert itself was holding its breath. They had no water left. Stokes had been running diagnostics on the communications equipment every 90 minutes since the jamming started. At 1,510, he looked up from the system with an expression Holt had not seen on him before. "I've got a partial window. It's narrow, maybe 90 seconds. Send everything." Stokes sent. Position, status, personnel, water emergency, enemy disposition, He compressed it into the smallest possible packet and pushed it through the window twice before it slammed shut again. No response came back. Did it go? I think so. I can't confirm. Holt nodded. Then we wait, he said. It was Tanner who worked it out. He was lying on his back, the leg mate standing uncomfortable with his eyes on the sky, which was the only thing he could look at without it costing him energy to move his head. He had been doing ballistic geometry in his mind the way some people count ceiling tiles, occupying himself, keeping the cognition sharp despite the dehydration. The angle, he said. Holt looked at him. The angle on the technical. The driver took it from the left. Through the door. The gunner took it from above, and left you could see the entry point on his position. The round on the far vehicle came in shallow from the left. He paused. Everything's coming from a consistent azimuth, left of our position, which is northwest. Holt had been doing the same geometry. He hadn't said it because saying it meant committing to a course of action that was high risk. There's a ridge, Webb said. I clocked it yesterday, about 3 clicks northwest, maybe a little more. It's the only elevated feature on that axis. 3 kilometers, Mathers said. Plus. At 3+ kilometers, you can't hear the report. At 3+ kilometers in this terrain, there's no way to visually acquire the shooter's position from ground level. At 3+ kilometers. At 3+ kilometers, Holt said, someone's been doing this for 2.5 days. Silence. The desert creaked with heat. Somewhere, a piece of metal on the stop technical ticked as it expanded in the afternoon sun. We go tonight, Holt said. We move toward the ridge. We check it, and if it's hostile, we're no worse off than we are right now. He did not add, because right now we're going to start losing people to the heat by morning. He didn't need to. Everyone who looked at Pruitt's face understood the math. They moved at 2,200 when the temperature had dropped to something survivable. Tanner moved with one hand on Webb's shoulder, keeping his weight off the left leg, jaw tight, breathing through his nose. Nobody offered to leave him. Nobody suggested he slow them down. They moved at his pace, which was slower than optimal and faster than anyone had a right to expect. The terrain was flat between their position and the ridge flat and open, which meant moving carefully, using every irregularity in the surface for cover, stopping every 300 meters to listen. They found nothing in their path. Whatever security the enemy had maintained around the western axis was gone, either pulled back entirely or casualties from 2 days of attrition. At 0040, they reached the base of the ridge. Holt took Mathers and went up alone, leaving the others in cover below. The slope was gentle 8 meters of elevation over about 40 meters of horizontal, which meant crawling the last 20 on their stomachs, moving the way they'd been trained to move, which was like the ground itself was breathing. At the crest, Holt stopped. He could see the firing position from 15 meters away. It was not much to look at. A slight depression in the ridge where the sand was compacted differently. The kind of hollow that forms when a body has spent long hours pressed against the earth. A small pile of brass to one side, arranged rather than scattered, which told him something about the shooter's discipline. A ground sheet, pale and dust-covered, that had been spread and then carefully folded back, evidence of someone who was meticulous even at the end. He moved forward. She was on her side. She had shifted from her firing position at some point, probably involuntarily, as the dehydration and heat reached their terminal phase. The rifle was where she'd left it, oriented downrange, bipod extended, bolt handle up, a round in the chamber. Ready. Holt put 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse, weak, but present, regular. He looked at the rifle, then at her, then at the terrain below. 3+ kilometers of open desert, heat shimmer distorting the flat ground into something almost oceanic. He did not call down to the others. He just sat there for a moment, in the dark, with the desert cooling around him and the stars overhead and a woman he did not know breathing shallowly at his feet. He thought about what it meant to choose a position like this one. No cover, no concealment from above, no shade, no water resupply, no way out if the mission turned against her. She had come here knowing those things. She had stayed here, for he looked at the small notebook near the brass pile. 71 hours, based on the first entry. 71 hours in 49-degree heat, without adequate water, without sleep, without anyone who knew where she was. Not for orders. He called down to Mathers. Mathers assessed her in the dark with the efficiency of someone who has done trauma medicine in conditions far worse than this. Severe dehydration, 2nd and 3rd degree burns on exposed skin, the backs of her hands, the back of her neck above the collar, a strip across her right cheek where the sun had caught her through a gap in her cover. Poor temperature elevated. No obvious structural injuries. Her breathing was labored but clearing as Mathers worked, starting an IV from his emergency kit, the only IV bag they had left. While Mathers worked, Webb picked up the rifle. He was not thinking about the engraving specifically. He turned the rifle over in the way a professional handles another professional's equipment, assessing condition, noting the modifications, reading the 0 marks on the scope turrets, which told him the system had been set up by someone who understood the math at extreme distance. He checked the barrel worn at the crown in the pattern of a weapon that had been used extensively, but not abused. The trigger, when he tested it in the safe direction, broke cleanly at what felt like a tuned 2 pounds. Then he saw the stock. The engraving was on the underside, near the pistol grip. Small numerals, cut precisely, no decorative elements. 4112. And then a lowercase m, because whoever had done this was not in the habit of imprecision. Webb went still. Holt looked over. What? Webb held the rifle so Holt could see the stock. Holt looked at the number. He looked at the terrain below the flat desert. The heat shimmer, even in the dark, turned to a kind of silver distortion, the vast nothing between this ridge and wherever she had been shooting from and toward. 4,112 meters, Webb said quietly. I can read numbers. I know what it is. They stood there. Mathers, who had heard the exchange, looked up from his patient. That's 2.5 miles. Yes, that's not. Mathers. The medic stopped. Holt crouched and looked at the woman. At the burns on her hands. At the way the skin around her lips had cracked in a pattern that told him she had been dry for a very long time. She was here before us, he said. What? He reached down and picked up the small notebook. Flipped to the first page. The handwriting was small and extremely neat. The kind of script that comes from someone who grew up being taught that neatness was not optional. The first entry was dated 73 hours ago. The first reference to the SEAL team described only a 6-man element, U.S. military, compromised, observation position at rock formation grid appeared on page 3, hours after her own insertion. She had found them. She had assessed the situation. She had made a decision that was, by any military calculus, well beyond what could be expected of a solo operator in her circumstances. And she had executed that decision without deviation for the next 51 hours. Holt sat back on his heels. Somebody do the math on those casings, he said. Pruitt, who had been sitting with his back to the ridge face, looked at the pile of brass. He counted carefully in the limited light. 31, he said. 31 rounds, Tanner said. Over 71 hours. Against how many confirmed contacts? Nobody had an exact number. At least 15, Webb said. Between the ones I confirmed and the ones we can infer from when they stopped advancing. 31 rounds. Minimum 15 confirmed effects. Holt looked at the terrain again. At ranges starting around 3 kilometers and going, he stopped. He looked at the number on the rifle again. That number doesn't mean the range she was shooting from, Tanner said slowly. No, Holt agreed. That's a personal record. Yeah. Tanner looked at the woman on the ground. At the burns. At the IV going into her arm. How? He said. Not incredulous, just genuinely trying to understand the physics. You want to know how? Holt said. Finish the math first. Wind, elevation, Coriolis, spin drift, density, altitude. Every variable. Write it out. Tanner started to. Stopped. Looked at her again. No, he said. I don't need to write it out. No. The desert was quiet. 4,112 meters. In full summer heat. At density altitude. Against a moving target. With a manually operated rifle and a notebook. The number sat in all of them like a stone dropped into deep water. There was no time to read it fully. They were still behind enemy lines. Still without reliable communications. And one of their people was still showing symptoms that needed a medical facility, but Holt read enough. She had tracked the enemy element's movements in real time, triangulating from her elevated position. She had prioritized targets by tactical significance, not by ease of shot. The hardest shots were the ones she'd taken first, when she was freshest. She had noted each engagement with clinical brevity, range, wind, shot placement, effect observed. No drama, no self-assessment, just data. On the third morning the day they'd found her, she had made a final entry. The handwriting was degraded. The letters were larger than the previous entries, slightly less controlled. Someone tracking her own cognitive decline in real time and documenting it anyway. Water 0 since 0300. Heat significant. Motor fine. Cognition moderate, beginning to intrude on suppression calculations. Running second check on all figures. Team element appears stable. Holding position. Enemy pulled back overnight. Estimate regrouping for final push AM. 30 rounds remaining. Range consistent. Wind consistent. They don't know I'm here. That's fine. 30 rounds is enough. There was no self-pity in the entry. No heroic framing. Just a professional at the end of her resources, noting the situation with the same detachment she'd applied to the whole operation. Below that, in writing that was noticeably shakier, entry made 1,142. If I'm reading this, it worked. If someone else is reading this, make sure the team is okay. Holt closed the notebook. He put it in his chest pocket. Stokes, he said. Tell me you can get the window again. Trying, Stokes said from below. We need extraction for 7. 1 priority medical. Chope. And we need it fast. She stabilizes when we move. But she needs a hospital, not a field dressing. Copy. Holt looked at his team. At Tanner with his improvised splint. At Pruitt, who was more alert now that he'd had water from the IV line. Mathers had briefly redirected a decision Mathers had made quietly without asking anyone's permission. At Webb and Stokes, running on no sleep and no water and the specific discipline of people trained to keep moving past the point where ordinary people stop. We're going to carry her, Holt said. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. The withdrawal was not elegant. It was 3 kilometers of open desert in the pre-dawn dark. carrying a woman who weighed Mathers estimated around 60 kilograms with her kit across terrain that offered no reliable cover and no certainty about what the enemy knew regarding their current position. The Technical with its dead crew sat somewhere to the south. The flanking elements had been quiet for 6 hours. Whether they were regrouping, recalibrating, or simply done, nobody could confirm. Holt made the decision. Move south, toward the Wadi, which was the original secondary exfil point and the most defensible position within reach. They moved in pairs. Webb and Holt on the litter 2 ground sheets joined by their rifle slings, which Mathers had improvised in less than 3 minutes. Tanner and Pruitt on flanks. Tanner's movement limited but his eyes and trigger finger functional. Stokes running communications in motion, which meant one hand on the radio and one hand on a weapon. She was unconscious for the first kilometer, then semi-conscious, aware enough to realize she was being carried, not lucid enough to process why or where. She made no sound except her breathing, which was steadier than Holt had expected. At the 600-meter mark, a single vehicle